to Take It from the Iron Woman. My name is Susanne Müller, your host and the Iron Woman. This podcast is about empowering yourself and others to make real changes in the world. You will hear from everyday, smart, sophisticated, hip people like you and me. Not everybody has to be an Iron Woman to impress the world. Together, we will learn from the sports and business leaders how you can become a more successful person as an entrepreneur or a leader. It's one step at a time, one day at a time. Take your steps now. Take your big steps now. Join me on this journey to success. Take it from the Iron Woman. We only have special guests today. After more than 250 episodes, we go to Caroline. She is the Director of Strategic Communications at the Ballot, but her resume is just simply amazing. Her work has taken her from the halls of the United Nations to refugee camps in East Africa, where she has partnered with women and youth on digital storytelling projects and technology-driven public health initiatives. It is 20 years of strategic communications experience in working with organizations to advance social and economic justice, both nationally and globally. And the list goes on. Caroline, welcome. Just introduce yourself. Who is Caroline who's going to join us today?
Oh, thank you, Suzanne, so much for having me on your podcast. It's really an honor to be here. Well, Caroline is a work in progress, I always like to say. I come from a lot of different types of careers. I'm one of those folks that I think you could point to and say it's very nonlinear. In many ways, I didn't think it was by design when it happened, but looking back on it now, as I'm older and looking back at my career, I have not been one to make career choices based on security. I've let my curiosity drive my career. More recently, as an example, as you've mentioned, the Strategic Communications Director at the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, which is a national infrastructure organization that works in the electoral space, and we support progressive campaigns all over the country and in their progressive ballot measure campaigns. I have not been working in the electoral or voting rights space my whole life. I was in the global development work my whole life. I worked in partnership with the United Nations and many global NGOs. I've worked abroad all over the world. My work has taken me, but it wasn't until this past election, when Trump was elected, that I felt very called to do this kind of work. I'd spent 20 years, almost 20 years at that point of my life working in global development, in foreign affairs. And as an American, that was totally fine. I never really thought much about it. But it wasn't until I think a lot of my own values came into question based on the direction that my own government was going in, that I felt very called to do this kind of work. And many people, when I switched career sectors, if you will, and decided to go into electoral and political work, said, developed this incredible career in global development. Why would you all of a sudden become the student again? I said, because I want to be challenged. I will always love the global development sector, and I'm still in it in many ways, but this was such a challenge for me. And it was something that fed my curiosity. It fed my system of values that I hold very dearly. And I knew at that moment that it was time for me to do something different and to look around me and say, what can I do to support the communities that mean so much to me at home?
First of all, thank you so much. We need more of you. I've never heard of this organization. And I want to say, if I don't know, I think the listeners don't know. Tell us more, give us more details. And I'm always curious, like, how can I be involved, or how can the listeners be involved?
The Ballot Initiative Strategy Center is a national infrastructure organization. We're based in DC, but really we work with communities and states all over the country on progressive ballot initiatives. And people are like, what is a ballot initiative? What is a ballot measure? And essentially, we voters know them as ballot questions or propositions, right? Sometimes you hear people are fighting for Prop 208 or Prop 19. Well, these are all questions that appear when you go to vote, right? So if you're voting for candidates, at the bottom, there's usually a set of questions. Those are called ballot initiatives, and they fall under an umbrella of that name, ballot initiatives or ballot measures. And what they are they're people-powered democracy. It is the people who are essentially bringing a new law to their state or choosing to amend a law, gathering enough signatures from the voters in the surrounding community that will be affected by that vote, whether it be a statewide measure or a municipal, more local measure, and collecting enough signatures to actually have the state legislature approve of that ballot measure to appear in the next election. And voters go, they vote for their candidates, and along the way, while they're in the voting booth, they will vote, or by mail, they will vote for whether they choose yes or no on a ballot initiative, a ballot question. And so while ballot initiatives are not active in all states, they are in many. And it is very, very important when you ask me, Suzanne, like, what can we do? What can people like me do? Stand up for voting rights. I think voting rights all around, even if you don't, New York and New Jersey, which are the states that I really live and work in, don't have ballot initiatives, but it doesn't mean that they do have municipal measures. You will still get ballot questions in your local election, which will affect your community, but we don't have statewide ballot measures that will affect the entire state, say in New York or New Jersey. They're more municipal measures. But fighting for voting rights right now is really important, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. I think the more we expand access to voting rights and to the people to vote, the better off we are as a democracy. It's really the basis of our Constitution. It's the basis of who we are as Americans. And the more we create limitations and boundaries around voting and voting rights and when we can vote and how we vote, the lesser we are and the farther away we are to the values that make us who we are.
I became an American citizen 7 years ago. For me, it was important to vote. One interesting fact about Switzerland: only in 1971, women were able to vote. I mean, it's a very sad statistic. For me, voting is something that is in my DNA, and I want to do that, and I want to be part of it.
That's wonderful. And it's very true. One of the most important things we can do as citizens is to vote, is to have our voices heard. One of the things that I wanted to stress is that the work that we do specifically centers people of color. And these are the people that have often less access to vote. They are often it's much more difficult for them to get to the voting booth. They are often excluded from initiatives that include people of color. Gerrymandering, as we know, is very popular right now and is a way to not empower people of color and communities of color, queer communities, LGBTQIA communities. When we talk about voting and voting rights and progressive values, I think it's really important that we do center people of color, because though they are the ones that are closest to the hurt, and so therefore should be closest to the solutions.
As I said before, we need more of you. And I think it's also about being informed. And you mentioned the curiosity. So you want to learn something new. Tell us a little bit about your global experience that you had before. It sounds so glamorous. And certainly you met great people and you were working in the halls of the United Nations, to refugee camps in East Africa.
Oh, it's funny because it does sound glamorous. In reality, it's very much not.
It's a lot of work.
Yes, it's a lot of work. And it's my most precious memories are working abroad. And they always say, oh, you were there. And I was teaching in refugee camps, working with youth refugee with organizations like Film Aid International and the International Rescue Committee, all via the UN, who facilitates our travel and our stay in refugee camps because of UNHCR. And they always say, oh, you did so much work there. And in reality, I was the one that was most affected and learned the most from the people that I was there to serve. And
what I always think, right? You go there, you think you're helping the people. Meanwhile, you're experienced so much.
Exactly. It's such a reversed experience that you almost feel guilty taking so much because you want to give so much. But in reality, you realize how much you're giving. I did a lot of different types of work. When I finished college, I was working on a master's in theater. I was an actress. I did producing. I wrote plays, and I was working on a play about the Spanish Civil War and what happened to the refugees after the Spanish Civil War. And there's actually quite little written that I could find at that point. Now it's different with the internet being as filled as it is with information. But I was looking for information to what happened with the Spanish refugees in Spain when they left Spain to go to France during their own war, which coincided with World War II and the Holocaust, which came almost right around that time. There was some overlap there. And I couldn't find anything, but I did some research, some very preliminary research on the internet. And I found this woman who worked at the International Rescue Committee. And she had worked in Spanish refugee aid back in the late 30s, early 40s. It was an email. I reached out to her and I said, I'm working on this play. I don't have enough information about like what it was like to be in a refugee camp in France when you were a Spanish refugee during the war. And she said, oh my goodness, she was English. And she said, no one has asked me about this in 30 years. Who are you? Come in. I went to the office of the International Rescue Committee and I met with her and she provided me with so much information, her own experiences, videos, books. And it was at that point that I started kind of working with her a little bit. She was transitioning out. She was retiring and she needed help kind of closing shop at the IRC. And I became very interested in refugee work because that's what the International Rescue Committee does. And so hence my career went from I was doing TV hosting and journalism as well. And I did some acting on the side and it really switched to aid and international development aid with a focus on refugee aid and forced migration. And I got a job as the communications officer at Film Aid International, which used to be a project of the International Rescue Committee. And now it's its own NGO organization. And they work with refugees all over the world, mostly youth, in film storytelling projects. So essentially, they would empower themselves to tell the stories of what they were dealing with in the camps, whether it be forced early marriage or cholera and HIV, any of the other issues that would affect them in the camps. And they would create short films that they would then show to the community. And I traveled to Kenya, to Kakuma refugee camp, and I worked with the storytelling team there. And I taught a filmmaking workshop. I taught an acting workshop. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience, as difficult as it is now. I'm still in touch with so many of the students that I work with because many of them have migrated out. Many of them are in Canada, in the US, and we still keep in touch, which is really wonderful. And I'm so inspired by their journeys every single day when I see them doing all these brave and courageous and wonderful things. But then after that, I stayed in the global development sector. I worked at Trickle Up, which is a global poverty alleviation organization that works with really the poorest of the poor, people living on less than $3 to $5 a day, mostly women as well. And I wanted to start an organization of my own, a social enterprise called SourceRise, which really connected journalists with on-the-ground resources to really tell the story of what's going on in different parts of the world, specifically during times of crisis when it's really tough to information gap and it's sourcing local journalism and local knowledge from the community and the elders to really tell the story of the communities that are being affected by whatever circumstance that they're in. I spent most of my career traveling. We went to India and Central America, Africa, East Africa, specifically in the Horn of Africa. I started getting involved locally after the last presidential election and when Trump was elected. And I live in northern New Jersey. There was a group of women locally. Talk about grassroots. That's where it begins, right? And they're called Women for Progress. And they weren't called that when I joined them at first, but it started burgeoning. And all these women, these career women, a lot of them working, a lot of them at home raising children, wanted to do something with their time. They wanted to take back their power in a time that they felt very powerless and at a time where they felt that their values were really being hit on. That we mobilized. And the woman who runs it's incredible. Her name is Erin Chung. She became, through this group, a very influential political leader in New Jersey, where it has the governor's ear, the mayor's ear. It's been to watch her grow in these last 5 years has really been incredible and has taught me so much about the importance of grassroots mobilization and the importance of keeping women in the process.
I think now is the time. I was reading a book, On the Arena by Katrin Adams, and she says, on the table, on the arena, if the people are asking you to be at the table, like in a meeting, in a conference, they want to hear you, not anybody else. Because a lot of people say, why would they hear me? I'm nervous. I don't know. No, they want to hear from you.
Exactly. It really is. And I think we've seen a real surgence in the last 5 years of not only women getting more involved in the electoral process, but running for office, which is really a wonderful thing that has come out of, for many of us, a dark time in politics. But we have seen the surgence of super qualified women who, as you pointed out, Suzanne, often feel underqualified, but are the most qualified to run, right? We underestimate ourselves so much. We have this habit of looking at a job description and saying, if we don't check everything on the job description, we must not be qualified. Meantime, oftentimes, I don't want to make an overall umbrella statement, but sometimes men will look at a resume and rightly so will say, well, I don't have all the qualifications, but I'm still going to. And that's the right idea. If you have looked at a job description and you can do everything on it, you're probably overqualified, is what I always say.
That's a very good point. I think the ratio is like 25%. If the men know 25% of a job description, they apply, it's 75. And I'm like,
that's right.
No. And it's kind of like when you go in those reality shows, when they press the button, actually you need to press the button before you know the answer.
I love that. I love
what is next.
What is the pressing of the button? I think leaning in is a process. The more we find our voice and allow ourselves that seat at the table, literally and proverbially, the more we are able to bring our full selves. And I think for many of us, that is a process. And it is a process that I find we need to encourage in each other, in other women. So I think it's always really important. And I mentor, whether it be through a mentoring program. I had worked with Latinas Think Big for a long time. I'm still involved in their work. Or if it's mentoring the women in my organization who report to me, I think it's really important to lift up their leadership. And as a leader, I try to get out of the way. I don't need to speak for them. And I think it's also emulating for other women how they can be around others. And it doesn't have to be, you can do that for men as well, but to allow other people to shine and lift up their leadership is a practice. And I try to do that as much as possible. At times when people will sometimes just default to me speaking, I'll turn around and say, no, actually, Suzanne had a great idea earlier that she shared with me. I'd love for her to share it with this group, right? And it's a deference. It's being deferential, and it's empowering others to really own their own ideas, own their voices, and really speak out.
When are you running?
Oh, you won't find me running anytime soon. But what is next for me is really building on the work that I started when I joined the organization that I'm in right now, BISC, the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center. It was a little over a year ago. It was right before the election. It was a crazy time to start. But we are seeing so much forward movement in people-powered democracy that I am really, really excited for what the future brings, and to have more people involved in their democracy, to stand up for their rights when they feel and they see that their rights are being taken away from them, and to speak up about it, because democracy dies in the darkness. And so we have to have our voices held. We have to hold on to the rights and fight for more. I'm excited to be a part of the process to expand all of these things.
We need more of you, as I said before. Thank you so much. Well, I do my part. I think the podcast is a wonderful platform to showcase others, actually lift up others, bringing people together, bringing the right people together. And if we connect all on a better level, we can achieve much more.
I totally agree, Suzanne. I think what you're doing is wonderful. And the more we give each other a platform to have our voices heard, the better off we are. We're all made up of stories. We're all just a collection of stories that need to be told. And that's how we grow. That's how we learn. That's how we heal. Thank you, Suzanne. It was great being here. Such an honor.
Thank you. We need to be informed. We need to be curious. And sometimes it's time to change the fields that you're working in. She did it. She wants to be curious. She's a new student again. Take it from the Iron Woman. We have episodes every Monday, every Wednesday. Don't miss out. There's something for everybody. From people like Caroline, runners, Ironman, coaches, authors. We have them all. We have stories from people from all continents in the world and in multiple languages. Join us again when you have the time, and thank you for supporting us and following us.